Okay, alhamdulillah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I'd like to begin. We are here at the top of the hour. It is 6 o'clock here in the East Coast, and I am thrilled to be able to host this fine gathering this afternoon or evening or morning, depending on where you all are logging in around the world. We are celebrating the launch of a fabulous book called Curriculum Renewal for Islamic Education. And we are joined by some of the chapter co-authors and the lead editor of this text. I'd like to begin by giving praise to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for allowing us all to be here together at this time to celebrate this book launch in a time when there is a lot of difficulty and devastation and pain and loss that many of us are feeling and experiencing in our own local communities and responding to the global pandemic and the other pandemics of racism and anti-Muslim racism that continue to exist today. But for this moment and this time, we are going to center Muslim joy. We are going to celebrate and champion and honor this fabulous book that has come out as a guide for all of us, whether we see ourselves as educators in Muslim schools, whether we are Muslim educators in public schools, whether we are parents educating our children in home, or community members educating the children of the community. I'd like to begin briefly by just simply introducing myself. My name is Amara DeCure, and I'm an executive board member for the Center of Islam in the Contemporary World, and I'm also a faculty member at American University. And what makes this particular book launch so exciting for me is that this is co-organized, co-sponsored, co-hosted by some of our powerful Muslim organizations, both here in America and around the world. The first organization that I would like to name is the Center for Islamic Thought and Education in South Australia. This is the institutional home of the lead editor, Dr. Nadim Memon. Also, the CISNA, the Council of Islamic Schools of North America, is also one of the co-hosting organizations for this session here this evening. ISLA, the Islamic School League of America, is another one of our co-organizing organizations, and the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World. So it's fabulous, it's exciting that we have groups coming together to champion the start of bringing this book into our homes, our libraries, and our school communities. So I have a very simple PowerPoint presentation that I would like to use this evening to help us organize our conversation. And I do want to reaffirm that I'm hoping this is going to be an engaged conversation with the educators and the guests that we have on the panel, as well as the educators and the guests that we have here in the audience. So I invite you, as hopefully you're very familiar now in Zoom, to use the Q&A function or the chat function at the bottom of your screen to post any questions or comments that you would like our guests to address. And I will do my very best to try and facilitate that active discussion as we move through today's conversation. So looking at my first slide, I'm going to move forward for a conversation on the Curriculum Renewal for Islamic Education book launch. And to start this conversation, I'm going to introduce the lead editor, Dr. Nadim Memon. He is a senior research fellow in the Center for Islamic Thought and Education in Education Futures at the University of South Australia. He is currently the, currently the program director for an online accredited graduate program in Islamic pedagogy offered through UNISA. His research focuses on teacher education with particular emphasis on Islamic pedagogy, comparative faith-based schooling, philosophy of religious education, and culturally relevant and responsive teaching. He is author of A History of Islamic Schooling in North America, published by Routledge in 2019. So Dr. Nadim, can you start by introducing all of us to your book by answering, why this book? Why now?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Jazakallah khair, Dr. Amara, for the introduction and for hosting this, facilitating this conversation. I think it's a very important conversation. This book is really, it's been a journey for all of us. There's been 18 educators from around the world who've contributed to this book. And all of us have been working in the field of Islamic schooling, Islamic education broadly for many years. And I think this book is really, it's meant to be a response to probably one of the perennial needs of our field, which is the need for a curriculum that speaks to the needs and contexts of the students that we aspire to educate. But at the same time, I think it's important to recognize that this book stands on the shoulders of giants, of people that have been doing extensive work on curriculum development in Islamic schooling for decades. You know, the people, I mean, I think it probably, at least in the United States, it probably began rightfully with the Sister Clara Muhammad schools and the extensive work that was done by the committees inspired by Imam Warithuddin. People like, I remember speaking with people like Dr. Qadir Abdus Sabur and Dr. Zakiya Muhammad years ago, who said, you know, we've been working on curriculum since the 80s. You have people like Dr. Tasneema Ghazi and Abdullah Ghazi with their work at Iqra, and Dr. Frida Shama and Dr. Nabil Saadoun, and the list can go on. And, you know, the work of Dawood Tawhidi. I mean, we can't forget the work that's been done by the pioneers of Islamic schooling in North America. And I think this book really stands on those shoulders. And we're lucky, we're privileged to have two of those pioneers with us as contributors in the book, and panelists, you know, here with Dr. Susan Douglas and Dr. Seema Imam. MashaAllah, we are indebted by every stretch of the imagination to the work that's been done over the past few decades in Islamic schooling. So this book is really, it's really that response to say, based on all of the work that's been done, where do we go from here? What would the next step be? And I think for many of us, we get asked very often about, you know, can you point us to a curriculum that exists that you agree with? Can you work on a curriculum? Is there a curriculum? Can you give us a curriculum? And you get all these curriculum questions. And I think our collective response is to say that if we were to give an Islamic school a curriculum, it probably wouldn't suit the needs of that particular school, because there's such diverse contexts and diverse aspirations that we all have of what defines what we would want to have in a curriculum for Islamic schooling, that it makes more sense probably to provide guidance to educators who are working in Islamic schools, to empower ourselves to become curriculum designers ourselves. So this book is really intended to become that sense of empowerment. We envision this book to be used as the reading for a professional learning community in our schools, to lead curriculum conversations in schools. And so the vision of this book was to say, how do we take a constructively critical look at what's been done, and at the same time start gathering a way forward of what curriculum renewal could look like.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And it speaks to a larger movement that we have in education today of flattening this hierarchy and making education innovation and advancement more acceptable to a wider audience. And I think that's what makes this book appear to be and truly is accessible to the reader, and allows someone to be and feel empowered to imagine new possibilities for their curriculum. For those of you in the Zoom space that have not yet received your own copy of the book, Once you have your copy, and we'll talk with you at the end about how you can get a copy, you're going to see that the book is divided into 3 core sections. And so I'd like to introduce you all to each of the 3 sections of the book, and in doing so, introduce chapter authors who are here tonight as panelists to speak to the work that they have contributed to that particular section. The first part of the book is titled the Islamic Studies Curriculum. And there are chapter authors for this section here. I'll leave those on the screen so that you can get excited by what is included in this part and the rich depth of knowledge that comes through in these different chapters. And although we don't have one of these chapter authors with us here for this evening, I've asked Dr. Nadeem to speak broadly about what is in this particular section of the book. And I think, Dr. Nadeem, I'd like to preface this by saying, as educators in Muslim school spaces, many of us recognize that Islamic studies has both ideals and realities that sometimes come forth as tensions that Islamic studies educators need to wrestle with. Both honoring the ideals and the traditions of Islamic studies that has such a deep, rich heritage, and wanting Islamic studies to speak to the lived realities of Muslim students today. So could you speak broadly and introduce us to this part of the book, and how do the authors contribute to helping us as educators better understand how to make sense of this tension and use this to thrive and foster curriculum renewal?
Yes, Bismillah. I mean, I think that this is a foundational. Each part of the book adds a different component to the foundations of curriculum development, and this first part focuses specifically on Islamic studies. And what we tried to do here is we tried to say there's been a lot done in the field of Islamic studies in particular through curriculum, but then also through learning resources. So what each of the contributors do in this part of the book is they go through existing frameworks that exist. So curriculum resources out of South Africa, out of Malaysia, out of the US, curriculum textbooks that we're used to looking at, and really sort of do a constructive, critical look at how things are being taught. What's the scope and sequence? What are the key ideas? Are the key ideas age appropriate? How do we think about the development of a Muslim learner and their needs, their contextual needs? And how does that fit with what we're teaching around the Quran or we're teaching around fiqh? So we try to think, for example, in terms of how do we consider or reconsider what's being taught when at each age level? And that for each chapter, they provide sort of an introduction to what's out there first. And then the second part of it is to look at, well, how do we make the curriculum in Aqidah, in Sirah, in each of these different areas relevant? How do we make it engaging for young people? How do we make it connect to the things that are on their minds? And at the same time, recognizing that in many Islamic schools, this is our one chance. When you're in Islamic studies, this is your one chance to really inspire young people, to really connect with their deen. So how do we ensure that if you have this one chance to connect with the Quran, you have this one chance to connect with fiqh, how do we make sure that it really resonates? So each chapter provides suggestions, not necessarily a way forward in terms of this is how it should be done, but more so broader suggestions of, if you were to make the Quran curriculum or the Aqidah curriculum address these issues of relevance and engagement and age appropriateness, here are some potential both content that we feel should be emphasized and also approach in how it should be imparted. So generally, I think that's the essence of part one.
So let me ask a follow-up question, if I may, and I'll put this into 2 parts. For many of our Islamic studies educators in our schools, this doesn't reflect how they were trained. It doesn't reflect how they experienced Islamic studies when they were younger, or maybe even training that they had in to prepare them as a classroom educator. So how can an Islamic studies educator move from relying on their previous experiences and training to teaching in the way that is modeled through this book? And then my second part is, how does this benefit students? Can you speak to what we know about what students are needing for us to engage in curriculum renewal of our Islamic studies?
Yeah, really, really good concerns. I mean, in terms of this is not how we are trained, I think, we, especially in particular, our Islamic studies scholars and those that are teaching Islamic studies, we need to acknowledge that they come with a vast amount of knowledge and background and expertise in the subject area. Now, probably one of the common ways that was articulated to address this is to take that expertise and then to look at the learners and the context in which we teach, and to ask ourselves, what is it that learners are looking for? How are they looking to engage? What are the types of conversations, the concerns, the questions that they're raising? And to shape the curriculum partly on the needs of learners, partly on us taking an opportunity to think about what it is that is appropriate for the right age. And at the same time, to then think about how do we tie that with the expertise we bring in. And I'll give you an example. Oftentimes, because what we've done in curriculum studies, in Islamic studies in particular, is we've tried to model it around the way we teach mathematics or the way we teach science, outcome-based, and we spread it from one outcome to the next. So if you take CITE, for example, oftentimes it's arbitrary how we're laying out the CITE curriculum. When we teach certain aspects, it's often very linear. And Dr. Susan Douglas will speak about this when she gets to her chapter, but the curriculum for history is often taught in a way that's very linear. When we think of Aqidah, for example, we'll take very complex topics sometimes and introduce them at a young age because we're going in a way that's one concept after the next that doesn't take into consideration human development, which Dr. Claire will speak about later in her chapter. So it's not just thinking about what content goes when, but it's also thinking about why that content is required at that time and that age appropriateness. So now to your second question, how is that going to benefit students? I think it's going to make the content relevant at each age level. What a child is learning in kindergarten or in grade 2 versus what they're learning in grade 10, we want to ensure that it's not repetitive content, but that it's content that speaks to who they are at that moment and their needs. I think a lot of this has to do with how do we begin to engage learners with what they're looking for in Islamic studies at a particular time.
I appreciate that. And I think that these are attributes of effective education when we have teachers that look to centering their curriculum and their pedagogical decisions on the needs of the learners, and students reap significant benefits when they are part of classrooms that are designed for their success. I'd like to move through part 1 and introduce our audience to the second part of the book, Islamic Worldview, Shaping Curriculum. And from this section of the book, we are blessed and fortunate to have 2 of the chapter authors here with us this evening to speak in depth about their own contributions to this text. I'm going to begin with the author of chapter 7, Dr. Susan Douglas. I'd like to introduce her as a K through 14, so kindergarten through higher education outreach director at Georgetown's Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, where Dr. Douglas conducts education outreach jointly with Georgetown's Al-Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. She received her doctorate in history from George Mason University in 2016 and an MA degree in Arab Studies from Georgetown University. Dr. Douglas was senior researcher on education for the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations and affiliated scholar with the Council on Islamic Education. She contributed to public history projects for the National Endowment for the Humanities, created curriculum for Unity Production Foundation documentary films, and has contributed to online projects such as World History for Us All, the Indian Ocean and World History, and Our Shared Past in the Mediterranean. Her publications include World Eras, Rise and Spread of Islam from 622 to 1500, a children's book on Ramadan, and Teaching About Religion in National and State Social Studies Standards, and numerous book chapters on pedagogical and policy issues. Dr. Douglas, I'd like to invite you into this space to share with all of us what you've contributed to this text through chapter 7, and specifically, if you can answer, what does it mean to teach Islamic history in a global context?
Thank you, Amara. Welcome, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here and very glad to have been able to contribute this through the skills and I will say persistence of Nadim and his co-editors. I think the most important message that I want to put out is that it isn't just Islamic history that we need to teach within a global context, but we need to look at the way in which we are teaching about the world. And that can move from not just social studies, but it can move into science, it can move into humanities, language arts, and so on. But in particular, there has been a movement in world history circles for 20 some years now and building up before that to get away from the old model of teaching civilizations one by one, sort of their rise and fall as a linear sequence that was really introduced into education in the 19th century during the imperial era. And it has all of the trappings of that, starting with the word civilization. Who isn't, who is, who's at what stage, and all of that kind of thing. And yet that model has persisted into the sort of Western Civ model, modified over time by adding, cultures to a sort of multicultural menu, which still, however, were often taught in isolation. So the world history movement, the global context, is instead to teach about the history of the world era by era, and to move through time and to teach it as an interactive enterprise, not just, a pink blob or a yellow blob of an empire that appears as, as a stand-in for a civilization in Rome or Greece or China or whatever it happens to be, but to look at the globe, which includes societies, civilization or otherwise. We don't have to bother always with the label, and the spaces in between them in which they interacted, like oceans, deserts, trade routes, whatever it happens to be. And when we do this for Islamic history, which is our example here, we are able to magnify the impact and students' understanding not only of the impact of that one society over time, but we're also able to at the same time recognize the contributions of others and to understand that Islam was an open society which took and gave as an open society. So that's kind of a little bit of an introduction to it, but it doesn't only magnify the contribution of Islam, it magnifies the contributions of every society. And maybe we'll have a chance to go into kind of the extreme way of looking at that in terms of how we got to modernity, rather than looking at multicultural contributions of this, that, and the other society, one by one, but as a kind of as a system that emerged from humanity, really.
Well, if I can, I would like to speak about bringing that into our schools when so many of us are working to satisfy local or even national curriculum mandates. How is teaching Islamic history through this global context able to be satisfied under these requirements that many of us in our schools are seeking to fulfill?
Well, the first one would be my sort of hobby horse that I ride whenever I speak about and with people, Muslim educators, is we are private schools and we don't need to. We are, first of all, there's that. We don't have to follow local, public, or state curriculum. And if we do, it should be not because we happen to be in state A, B, or C, but because we've studied and found this is the best one. What we can do is to look upwards, go up a couple of steps in the hierarchy and actually go back to, and this is not just in history, but also in other subjects, go back to the national documents that were put out with enormous effort and money that we could never have ourselves put out. The efforts between collaboration between scholars in the fields and teachers across the country to produce the national standards. They're not all perfection, but they are certainly a scholarly effort that the states, each one watered down and sometimes only preserved the rubrics from, and sometimes in its introductions usually kind of referred to. So further down the food chain, the testing regimes that different states put together are what's kind of left of it. And then districts have the freedom to build that back up. Not only can we meet the standards that are out there in the states, but we can easily exceed them if we go, leapfrog over this sort of local straitjacket and look to what national and international movements are going on among historians whose altruistic idea in putting these things together in the first place was they'd want to have better undergrad and graduate students coming up to them. They want ones who really know and not have to relearn history, from the ground up when they get to college, which many of us experienced, of course.
Well, let me ask this before I move on. Similar to how I posed this to Dr. Nadeem, this practice and concept of teaching Islamic history through this global view is not necessarily how social studies educators were trained, or maybe how they even experienced social studies and history when they were coming up. So how do you encourage teachers who see this, recognize this as a best practice, but don't know how to get started? Where should they go? How should they shore up their own understanding to be able to teach this way for their students?
That's a great question, Amar. Thank you. There are many tools that world historians have, and I'm this particular talking about Islamic history in the context of world history, which is where it's taught in social studies. Of course, a Muslim school is going to want to emphasize it more, but putting it in that global context in the course of social studies, letting it carry over into other subjects, do collaborative projects and things like that. In the humanities, pairing up literature from one of the compendia, such as the one that Frida Shama developed, Treasury. I've got one that I did with the Council on Islamic Education. There's a significant overlap. So there's lots of ways to incorporate literature and science and Islamic studies into this across a school, and should happen. But there have been a lot of materials put out, and I've been privileged to participate in several of those projects that are designed to help teachers make that transition between the old way we were taught and that many of the textbooks for regular kids still, kind of reproduce. Sit down and read one of the better advanced placement books that are being used, because they do follow a world history framework much more. I can provide a list if somebody wants to email it on to IECN or anywhere else like that, of what some of the best ones are, because these are models for teaching in a global context. How do you teach multiple societies at once? How do you teach? And one of the things we've been working on with the materials that I've been, producing for several years is, how do you teach about interaction among cultures as a topic of study rather than a multicultural add-on at the end of a discussion of the rise and fall of A, B, or C? And that's really exciting. So there are places. One of the best ways to sort of step in is to look at the K-12 curriculum, or it's really for secondary, where world history is generally taught from 6th grade up, called World History for Us All, because that was a collaboration between numerous researchers, history teachers, and 3 world historians with the help of others, work that was brought into it. And basically what that provides is a guide, a map of how to proceed through the eras model, from 1 through 9, basically, how to teach in a global context, lots and lots of teaching, of lesson plans. That's what they really are. The projects that were mentioned, the Indian Ocean World History, that was supported by the Omani Cultural Center, the Sultan Qaboos Cultural Center, and still out there. NEH projects that are out there. actually are designed to be teaching documents. The one that you mentioned in my bio, the Our Shared Past in the Mediterranean, are models of how to teach in this global way, how to move, like we do our workshops at Georgetown, we do the world in the region and the region in the world is kind of how, and you teach scaling and you teach students, but it's so exciting for teachers once they get into it, that they're sold usually and would never go back to teaching it the other way. But there are guideposts, and probably the simplest one to walk into is World History for Us All. It's hosted at UCLA in the Center for Public History there.
No, thank you. Those are great resources. And again, consistent with everything that comes from this book, it makes this concept of curriculum renewal so accessible to educators and within our reach. Dr. Omar, I'd like to bring you into this conversation. And before I do so, let me give you a proper introduction to this space. Dr. Omar Qureshi is currently the Provost and Assistant Professor of Liberal Arts and Islamic Studies at Zaytuna College, which he joined in August 2017. After obtaining his Bachelor of Arts in Microbiology, he went on to complete his Master of Education in Curriculum and Instruction with a focus on science education, both degrees from the University of Missouri, Columbia. Prior to Zaytuna College, for 7 years, Dr. Omar served as the principal and dean of academics for a parochial school located in Chicago's west suburbs. While in Chicago, he completed his PhD in cultural and educational policy studies, the philosophy of education at Loyola University Chicago in 2016. His dissertation was entitled Badr al-Din ibn Jama'ah and the Highest Good of Islamic Education, treats the topic of education institutional identity in the United States. In the religious sciences, Dr. Omar has studied texts in Islamic law, Shafi'i, Kalam theory, Islamic legal theory, Quranic sciences, Hadith nomenclature, prophetic biography, and Islamic history. Currently, he teaches the following courses at Zaytuna College: Contemporary Muslim Thought, Metaphysical Foundations, Imam al-Ghazali, and Islamic Legal Theory. Dr. Omar, it's a pleasure to have you in this space to bring science into this conversation. So I'd like to ask you if you could describe your chapter 8, and tell us, what does it mean to teach science from an Islamic perspective?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi sallam ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum. I wanted to thank Dr. Nadeem for his incredible work he's put together to push this project through. And alhamdulillah, we're bearing the fruits from that. And I want to thank you also, Dr. Amar, as well, for hosting us and leading this conversation. So the chapter that teaching science from an Islamic worldview. It's a really large topic. Nonetheless, I've arrived at a particular approach due to my own teachings of science in middle school and high school science, primarily a biology teacher, but then I moved on to teach chemistry, AP chemistry as well, and then physics. So throughout, and I've taught in independent schools and then also in Islamic schools. And throughout my, my teaching career, as Dr. Nadeem noted in the beginning of the chapter, there's about 5 different approaches that are identified to teaching science in Islamic schools. One of the approaches is what he termed canonical connections, has to do with, we'll teach science as it is in the curriculum, right? And as whatever standards that we're adopting in each particular state, and we pretty much teach whatever's there. We view curriculum as a textbook, which I advocate that we should not look at curriculum as textbooks, right? We take a standards-based approach to curriculum, and textbooks are one of many resources. So that's pretty much the approach that's adopted. And whenever a teacher encounters any type of connection between what's being taught in their science course and a particular Quranic verse or hadith, then they'll mention that relevant Quranic verse and hadith, and then they'll continue on, moving on, and teaching the same curriculum that pretty much you would find in any secular school. It's not much difference other than that. That's one approach. Another approach is to take this Muslim contributions approach, where we look at, here's where some history will come in, right, in terms of Islamic civilizational history. And we would identify great thinkers and great scientists of the past, al-Biruni, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, Ibn al-Nafis, all of these, and we would mention their accomplishments and their achievements, and then we would pretty much continue teaching the curriculum at hand, and just mentioning Muslim contributions to science. Then we take a topical issues approach where, okay, if we're going to address the issue of evolution, and then what we usually do then is, we'll teach evolution, and then some Islamic perspectives, will arise and be introduced to the classroom. Another approach is Islamic ethics, and they will take an ethical approach to dealing with certain scientific problems, mainly problems of technology. And then we have what's called the Islamic worldview approach. Now, this is not very common in Islamic schools in the West. But each of these approaches, each of these preceding approaches presents certain problems. So, if you take the Quran, the first approach where you just append a verse of the Quran or a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ to a particular scientific fact, invariably what happens is that a student will say, when they encounter another scientific fact, they'll say, well, this doesn't go, or this doesn't mesh very well with the Quran or this hadith. And then the teacher is left to resolve this problem that the student is encountering. And here is where we have to, ask ourselves as administrators and developers of curriculum, are our teachers being adequately prepared, right, to deal with these topics that are pretty involved, right, to resolve a Quranic verse or a hadith with a particular scientific phenomena or scientific or a fact in science that is being presented? It's quite a lot of work. And is it fair to ask the teachers in the classroom to teach the curriculum, but then to also go ahead and resolve these tensions, right, that come about from this canonical connections approach? And so that's some of the challenges that are produced here. And then from the Muslim contributions approach, right, then the question students ask are, well, why don't we see any Muslims nowadays or in the past 100, 200 years contributing to science? What happened, right? And it's then this idea of decline comes in, and then, there's all these other questions that come to be raised. And then the point here is that a lot of these questions aren't resolved, right, for our students, and they're not. It's due in no part. I'm not here to assign blame to anybody, and I don't think we should be. Rather, it's just taking account of the fact that a lot of resources are required to deal with these questions that come up between the teaching of science and religion. And our teachers, unfortunately, don't have these resources, because as a community in the West, I think we need to develop these resources. We haven't, and then at the same time, once these resources are developed, we all know as educators that much training is required, right? And so for teachers, in order for them to adequately deal with these topics here. So the approach I advocate here is to say that, well, what do we mean when we say integrating Islam, right? So integrating Islam is not really one of the approaches that that I would advocate for, that have preceded us. Nonetheless, here, what we mean by integrating Islam is to say, let's look at the theological. When we talk about a worldview, we're talking about, especially Islamic worldview, we're talking about the theological commitments that we make, the metaphysical, philosophical commitments that we make as Muslims, right? And how do those theological and philosophical commitments bear on theories of learning? How do we know? How do we come to know about the natural world? How do we, at the same time, once we know about the natural world, how is it that we relate what we're finding from the natural world to our theological and metaphysical commitments? And so this is adopting Islamic worldview approach allows us to have those important conversations. And at the same time, it allows us to, when we're thinking about religion and science, what's missing in not just Islamic schools at this point, but even in the West, when we look at science education, the state of science education in the West, there's two important aspects that are missing from science education in the West in the larger picture. One is the teaching of history of science, and the second is the teaching of the philosophy of science. And so students, even in secular schools, right, standard curriculums, they're really missing out on the understanding of the nature of science. And then they don't understand what we mean here by the nature of science, specifically the history and philosophy of science. And this is also important for us to recognize. And then as Islamic schools, we should really, this approach would allow us to understand not just religion and our religious commitments, but also the nature of science, meaning what is it when most of us look at science nowadays and we think that science is this objective arbitrator between what's true and false, and science has no, whenever a scientist says something, he or she will not have any bias or any type of inclinations, and it's just pure raw data that's being uninterpreted. Once we understand the nature of science, we understand that type of approach is really not tenable. And so many of these questions that come about in the classroom when teaching religion and science can be resolved once we understand A, religion, but B, once we also understand science and the nature of science, and particularly its history and philosophy. And so for this is the particular approach that inshallah we'll be advocating in this chapter, and what I talk about in more detail in this particular chapter.
Now, that was a very complex, clear representation, not just of what you're advancing and advocating, but what is so commonly experienced in many of our science classrooms. And again, consistent with the larger themes of the book itself, you help make it accessible for science educators to move from their training in their previous experiences as science students to a new and very much student-centered way of learning science as a Muslim student. I'm going to come back with follow-up questions for both Dr. Susan and Dr. Omar after we introduce the third part of this book, because I'd like to bring in our other two panelists into this conversation. Because the third part of the book, Islam-inspired curriculum renewal, is going to get us into some other conversations that I'd like us to have in this space. And so on the slide itself, you see all the titles that are in this particular chapter, and two of our guest speakers are here this evening. So Dr. Claire, I'd like to introduce you next to come into this conversation, representing the contributions you made to the book through chapter 11. Let me begin by introducing you properly to our Zoom room. Dr. Claire received excuse me, I need to pronounce your last name. So please jump off of mute if I mispronounce this. I should have fact checked this with you ahead of time. Dr. Claire Al-Kuwati, Atli.
Yeah.
Please, did I pronounce it correctly or did I butcher that?
You did. It's El Kowatli. It's from the word Koa.
Beautiful.
Strength. Koa.
It's absolutely beautiful, and a name I need to learn to pronounce effectively. Dr. Claire received her PhD in Human Development, Learning, and Culture from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, with a special focus on social and emotional development and qualitative research methods. She is currently serving as an adjunct research fellow at the Center for Islamic Thought and Education at the University of South Australia, and a development consultant for a new interdisciplinary women's studies master's program at Princess Noura bint Abdurrahman University in Saudi Arabia. Her current research projects involve inquiring into culture, relationships, and pedagogies in human development across the lifespan, from imaginary play to happiness and well-being to leadership amongst women, Muslim women. And Dr. Claire currently lives between her homes in Vancouver, Beirut, and Riyadh. So Dr. Claire, I'd like you to come into this conversation, share with us your contributions through chapter 11 into this text. And if you could speak broadly, why is human development important in curriculum renewal?
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So, I feel like human development is a bit of it's a bit of the elephant in the room that we don't always acknowledge is really one of our primary aims, not just in educating our young people, but also in educating ourselves across the lifespan. And, I entered back into the university after years as a writer and an editor, and then a mother, and watching my children develop in different cultures, I started to wonder, how is the culture shaping their development, and how are they developing differently in this cultural context versus that one? And so I actually went back to school to study this. And what I found was actually quite obvious, really, which is that we develop through the things that we do. So what are we doing with kids in order to expand their cognitive development, their social and emotional development, their spiritual development? And at first I was thinking, I'm going to go study human development so that I can, I don't know, just help kids develop in general. And then I got really interested in the idea of, actually, look, we want them to learn Islamic content material. And simultaneously, we want transformative human beings in our communities. We want to be transformative human beings. So why not think about how we can actually work with Islamic content material and in order to human development, in order to develop as human Muslims. I think that's the best way to say it. So my own background was in play, like in terms of with very young children, it was with play. And this chapter describes how, based on a common saying in Muslim communities, for the first 7 years, play with them. For the second 7 years, educate them. And for the last 7 years, be their friend. So I used this saying, and it was pointed out to me, it's not a hadith, but it's a prominent saying in Muslim communities. And maybe Dr. Omar could, talk to us more about that. But I thought that it was an excellent kind of framework to examine, just give educators some ideas of how we can actually foster human development in those particular age periods, through what are called leading activities, which are sort of age-appropriate activities for that span of life. So in the chapter, I look at play, I look at dialogue, and then I look at adult relationships. So one really interesting thing in this expression that may differ from kind of a Western academic understanding of adolescence is that relationships with older people are very important for adolescents. And we tend to, in a kind of secular Western dominant culture, we put kids all of the same age. 16-year-olds spend so much time with other 16-year-olds, where in fact, if they were spending time with 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds, this would be really generative for their development in that age in terms of who they want to become beyond this chaos of adolescence. So these are just like some very small and kind of obvious reminders of what we actually want to do as educators, which is to work towards transformative human development.
No, that's great. But then let me ask a very obvious question then that might be on people's minds. Why does your chapter show up in this book? What do pedagogies have to do with human development? Make the connections for us, please. If we are classroom teachers, what do we need to do beyond passing human development as we earn our master's degree? How does this really impact what we're doing in the classroom?
So pedagogies are like our tools of transformation. They are our, I don't know, this is probably an inappropriate reference, but like a magic wand kind of thing in terms of human development, because if we develop through practices, pedagogies are just a special form of practice. So pedagogies are actually, I would say, even more important in a way than the art of an educator would be to match pedagogy and content in a way that hits the heart of the person, the learner. So they really are the mechanisms of human development, the methods by which we engage children and youth and our colleagues and our elders.
No, that makes it very clear and centers it beautifully in this particular section of the text. Let me ask one final follow-up question before I bring in Dr. Seema. You do mention play and the importance of play with young people, but we're in schools, and schools require students to demonstrate achievement and growth and development over time. So how do educators measure learning and learning outcomes if they embody play pedagogies?
You know, this is another aspect of the art of the educator, which you are all much more experienced than me, because I don't work in classrooms. But the way that I have noticed that one can understand when learning is taking place, especially with a pedagogy like play, is if the children start, or if youth or adults start to make meaning of the material themselves, if they're passionate about the material, if they start to make cross-contextual connections between Islamic concepts and other concepts. So I think that, you know, assessment, and I think, you know, Dr. Seema is also an expert on assessment, but it's an area that I think we may have to completely transform in our curricula.
Sorry, it's that struggle to jump off of mute at a reasonable time. No, thank you. And you're absolutely very clear and speaking in a very direct and powerful way that when we, again, like many other messages that come from this book, when we design our classroom for the needs of young people, then young people will thrive. And there are many ways that we can speak creatively about how to measure that growth and that development over time. Dr. Seema, I am definitely not putting you last by any stretch, other than you bring up the closing round for this book and help to answer many of the questions in this chapter about how to tie this book together. So let me give you a more proper introduction, and then I have a question that I'd like to pose to you. But Dr. Seema Imam is a lifelong educator with numerous educational certifications, including superintendency, with experience in classroom teaching and school administration. Dr. Seema has served 25 years as a professor in teacher preparation, preparing elementary, middle level, and special education teachers. She holds a doctorate in curriculum and social inquiry, as well as a second doctorate in Islamic education. Dr. Seema is chair of the Islamic Schools League of America and author of numerous chapters and articles. So Dr. Seema, can you help to bridge the contents of your chapter with the work ahead for school leaders or teacher leaders, or even our school curriculum designers? How do we engage in effective evaluation, redevelopment, and curriculum integration rooted in Islamic principles? Or if I could put this more simply, if we've read this book, we got excited, and we want to bring curriculum renewal to our schools, what do we do?
Assalamu alaikum. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. First of all, thank you, Brother Nadeem, for bringing it to fruition. We're all really, really grateful to you. And for the work that we're here to celebrate. We are very grateful to the entire team that you put together. It's wonderful to sit with this group and be a part of it. Certainly don't know where to start and how to put so much into such a short time. But I think that we've said a few things about context. I think context is so key here. And I also think that one of the big deals here in curriculum is, what are students supposed to learn? What are they supposed to know and be able to do? And who decides? And if we don't really nail that down, and if we keep copying a public school and putting a Band-Aid here and a Band-Aid there, then what we'll have is an injured child with a lot of Band-Aids. And I don't mean that to be funny, but I've waited a long time for us to be able to take this and really run with it in a different way. This book prepares you for that. Not if we read it, when we read it. Let's read it together. Let's undo some of the things that Susan says and say how. You know, it's a process. My chapter talks about the process, the outcome of planning and how to be determined with your team. It has to be, until we change something, it has to be each school creating a new document for themselves, making very deliberate decisions about their own action plan, their own evaluation, their own method to redevelop. So they're not going to be able to do that based on a different school. So if we really engage in this, then we're really going to stop and bring all our stakeholders in and ask those questions of our stakeholders. What should children become while in our school? What is our product? What is the outcome? You know, and then if we have that passion and make those connections, first of all, we're going to create, if we don't have it already, if we evaluate, we're going to find out we had certain things in place, and we're going to find out certain things weren't there. So each individual team is going to make that determination. If we copied that public school and just added, we call it that stir in, we've been mentioning that for a couple of decades now, stirring in Islamic studies, you know, then we'll only have that as long as someone comes and stirs it in. We need it at the core, you know, and we have to figure out, like Brother Omar mentioned, you know, there are a lot of different possibilities. We may not be able to find one size fits all, but we're going to have to look at the core of our school and make deliberate determinations about vision and mission. The chapter talks about that. It doesn't say change your vision and mission. It says revisit it and determine if it's where you want to be. Maybe you'll revise it. Maybe you'll just learn to live it and learn what parts of the curriculum need to be really, you know, tweaked and massaged. I think it's essential really to look at the years past in a particular school and then to make a 5-year, a 3-year, you know, plan for the school looking ahead. You know, you can have a great curriculum and poor teachers, and you won't get very far. You can have great teachers and poor curriculum, and you won't get very far. Someone in this group said, after we start something, we have to have training. So we're going to need to find ways to gap the divide between what we've had. Arabic and Quran teachers, and many of them are still there. Many of them, I started in 90 in the full-time Islamic school. Many of them are still there, who really were just, you know, speakers of Arabic. You know, they had memorized Quran and they came into the schools and became teachers. They didn't have any theory or practice experience, you know, and that was true in Islamic studies and somewhat in Arabic. So in this chapter, we talk really about evaluating our school, taking it apart, taking a look, looking at the vision and mission, then redeveloping a plan, and then having an action plan orientation. So, you know, there are a few cities who've done something like this, gotten together and grouped their schools together. But when are we going to be able to say, what is 3rd grade doing? What is 4th grade doing? We're going to take an Islamic topic and not scare the children to death with it. We're going to do developmentally appropriate little bit, little bit, little bit, little bit, and they'll understand. Then they'll love it. They'll live it because they get it. They'll look back at history and say, what Susan teaches is awesome. She says, what was happening during that time? What do you suppose people were thinking? How do you know they were thinking that? What would you be thinking? You know, questions, connections. So I think, you know, there's a lot of logic behind looking at every one of these chapters and each part deliberately and getting together and saying, you know, like, this is everybody's concern. And we won't come up with one document, we'll come up with many. But we may discover that one is better, had better, foundations. I don't want us to forget about curriculum integration. I don't want us to forget about thematic teaching. They are solid and strong. We may have to find our ways to work with them. Not everyone can do it. I think that using these kind of things will save a teacher time. They don't have, if you're teaching argumentative writing, persuasive writing, why not do it on a topic that's useful to the student? I know throwing, the Park District is getting rid of the hoops. That's a good idea. Let's make the persuasive essay. But what about, a Hajj, persuasive, I can't talk, persuasive essay? Why isn't math teaching us about the Kaaba and all the numbers in math? Let the kids figure it out. What's the theorem? What's the practice that math can be completely connected? So before you know it, children can begin to think with that, that rose-colored lens of Islam. And then when they leave, and we did some research recently, we found out students are leaving Islamic schools without having necessarily what they need to be able to discuss Islam in public places. So if we didn't prepare them for that, was that not on our list? How did we miss that? How did we graduate them without this essential component? And I'm not even getting yet to Islamic Quranic worldview, right? So we have to lay this out. I used to say to public teachers, teacher candidates, lay your tables out, lay your books out on those tables and stretch it across and plan the year and plan how to save time. Well, in an Islamic school, that still fits. The third graders need to bring their tables next to the fourth graders and the fifth graders and the middle school. And we need to put Post-its on the gym wall and move those Post-its around until we don't have holes in the curriculum. We've really covered it. And then accountability for our teachers. We're all learners, lifelong learners. So I'm going to conclude with that, but don't forget your digital learning, ISTE standards, don't forget racial and social justice in school curriculums, and facing all those details are part of our responsibility. I hope I answered your question about engaging and bringing these chapters together for the benefit of our schools who are trying to do that.
No, you did. And I think I would want to amplify that you mentioned this is a process. So we should not assume that this book is a recipe, with step by step, and then we get to the end of the book, we have a solution. And I also heard you said that it's done in community across stakeholders in a school. So this is not a school leader sitting over the summer to redesign or to renew their curriculum. This is a community engaged process. And so I appreciate you emphasizing what it takes to bring this to life in a school community. I'd like to stop sharing my screen and be able to facilitate as much of an active discussion as I can on a Zoom space. I invite those who are joining us in the audience to post any questions that they would like me to pose to the guests by using either the Q&A feature or the chat feature. And until we get the first question, I'm going to lean in and ask a question myself. I'm going to direct this to Dr. Susan Douglas, but I invite the other panelists to contribute either from the perspective of their chapter or bringing in the depth of your expertise and knowledge to help respond to this. But Dr. Susan, Muslims around the world and Muslim young people specifically are having to navigate a world in which Islamophobia or anti-racism, anti-Muslim racism is prominent. How is a study, a deep, complex study of Islamic history through a global view, able to position students to not only navigate, but to disrupt this, whatever this is that is bearing down on our lives? How does this speak to the real urgent needs of our Muslim community? Oh, Dr. Susan, don't forget to unmute.
Good old thing. Yes, so that's a great question, a huge question, and it certainly involves everybody who's here on this panel, plus the rest of the authors of the book. But I would say that, if anything, is a very interdisciplinary solution to, I actually, in teaching world history, don't start with, I don't know, Mesopotamia, but we start with the creation of the world. And that actually, so does Montessori program, but we do it slightly differently. And when we come to the, the stages of the Earth's development, and then we come finally to, creatures, and then we come to the human being, we have DNA studies now that have been done on populations ever since, I don't know, 20 or 30 years now. And the mass of that information shows that we truly are brothers and sisters. We're taught that in Islam, but here we have now some evidence from people who were certainly not looking for simple origins of humanity, and who had gone through the idea that the special races were, this was a 19th century, idea, and early before that, the idea that each race, so-called race, was a separate creation with hierarchy of, I mean, these kinds of things, it helps students to learn what people thought and what scientific ammunition they had at the time, what knowledge level they had at the time. So this is also something that I'm sure that that Dr. Qureshi addresses in his methods of teaching science. At the same time, we have literature that can help us to understand this, and we're trying to integrate literature, humanities, with the study of history. And Islamic studies, certainly, Islam, from even the Prophet ﷺ last sermon about anti-racism. So it's a major enterprise, but I think looking at global contributions, there is, instead of this idea of a contest among, who created what, if we begin to teach these things as a series of human interactions, we find out that there isn't a single invention or part of an invention that didn't go through multiple hands and lands. And because of human communication and trade and desire to reach out, these inventions were communicated, sometimes unfortunately on battlefields and things like that, in hostile situations. But when we stop thinking like, this all originated from the idea that the West woke up one day and invented everything. And that has since been refuted, and we have plenty of evidence to know that that's not the case. Dr. Qureshi also mentioned the history of science, the history of thought. All of this built upon one another. And again, the fact that Islam was an open society, took taking in and giving out, is the stance where we don't put Islamic history into a behind a firewall and protect it as some kind of fortress, that this was the greatest thing, but rather understand that it was a living, breathing society. In fact, one of the things I mentioned in the book is teaching the view from the edge rather than the view from the palace walls, from the idea of sort of centered political dynastic history. That's just not useful. It's the people's history that will help us to understand these things.
No, that's great. And I would like to bring you in, Dr. Omar. How do you speak to this as a way of disrupting these larger isms that bear down on our Muslim community, and science being a space where these conversations can thrive, particularly knowing that in the world that we're living in now, we've loosely called this a post-truth, an anti-science type of a space. So how can science from an Islamic paradigm better speak to this? And Dr. Claire, let us know if this conversation is speaking to the developmental needs of young people. But Dr. Omar, please.
Yes, thank you. It's a great question, and a lot to say, but for our current purposes, here there's two things I would say here. One is, when teaching, for example, the history of science, how science was deployed, right, for purposes, for political purposes, right, such as eugenics movement, and how it was used to understand this concept of race. So we should teach those to our students, right? And that will be tackling, for example, that science can be used and deployed by different people for their own political agendas, right? And then this will give people an insight into the nature of science. Certainly Darwin was very key to this, especially in the 18th, 19th century, Darwinism played a key role, right, in how, when we look at Western, modern notions of race, for example. And so there's a lot to explore there. And then it also opens up vistas for students to understand if this is how science was historically being used, what are ways of science, what are current ways of science, how science is being deployed to different political agendas. And, when you can open up the door then to climate, change, you can open up the doors to, should we get a vaccine or not? Different political groups would use science for their own advantage, right? And depending on what political spectrum they're on, depending on what issue you're going to. So this definitely opens up itself into, much of, understanding the nature of science and how science gets deployed. The second thing I would say here is we should also look at terms such as Islamophobia itself. Who created this term? It is actually, they're philosophically, so from an Islamic worldview, would we use this term, right? Should we be using this? We should ask these questions as Muslims, right? I'm not saying yes or no at this point, but I'm saying that we should have thought this out, because I know many conversations that are happening where similar to any particular argument or criticism of the Jewish community becomes anti-Semitic. Are we doing the same thing? Are we saying any particular criticism of Islam or Muslims becomes Islamophobic, right? So when we use the term phobia, right, let's think about the term phobia and its signification of a irrational fear. Is that really what's taking place? I think there definitely are instances where they're taking place, but is every questioning of Islam and Muslims coming from a phobia? Well, the Quran teaches us no, right? The Quran, people questioned Islam, and the Quran preserves their questions and it preserves the answers to them. So part of being a Muslim is to engage in healthy dialogue. And so, and then the other question to explore with the term Islamophobia, we should be teaching our students is, what does it mean to say Islam is a race? Right. This is, so what we're doing here essentially is we're saying, when we use the term Islamophobia, we're kind of changing the category of Islam from a religion to a race. Are there problems in that when we do that, right? So these are some of the, again, I'm not going to give the answers to these, but I think these are questions that we should be discussing in our Islamic schools, and we should be encouraging these questions. So we see a race problem here. Are the terms and categories where we Muslims are using in the English language, are they themselves in line with the Quran's views, right?
No,
or not?
excellent.
Yeah. So those are the two things I would say to answer your question. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And it helps to, again, in the heart of science, to foster greater thought and investigation and examination. Dr. Nadeem, if you could come into the conversation and answer one of the questions from the room about social justice education, and more broadly, how can curriculum renewal be used as a tool to advance equity? And Dr. Claire, to what extent can we do this with the unique and nuanced needs of young people at the different developmental stages that they present within our schools?
Well, just to start off, I mean, I think the point about social justice and teaching from an Islamic worldview, that's essentially the point that we're trying to make in the book, around the second part of the book around Islamic worldview. It's about beginning with an Islamic worldview and not necessarily appending Islam onto an existing framework. So even when we think about social justice, for example, it's about beginning with, what does the term justice mean in the Islamic tradition? And how do we view our understandings of justice? I remember think a couple of years ago, Imam Zaid Shakir in the US spoke about, we need to start thinking about social, not just social justice, but social mercy and social responsibility, which is an equally important part of our tradition. That if we just focus on social justice, we're missing the aspect of social mercy and social responsibility. And I think when you start to think about these topics like social justice from within the Islamic tradition as your foundation, it shifts the way that the entire approach to equity, inclusive education, justice takes place.
That's mashallah. I would just add on to that, absolutely, that as Muslims, we have unique pathways to beauty and to generosity and to love and to mercy. And in these hard times, this is the time to develop ourselves, to be the best that we can be in the face of these difficulties, and I guess this could be my final point about human development, is that if we ourselves are not like constantly attending to our own development, how can we help those around us develop, whether they're our children or somebody who's giving us, a strange look because we're wearing hijab. So, I think self-development really has to start with us. And no matter what's going on, no matter who's, doing things to us, because as Dr. Omar mentioned, even in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there were people who were actively opposed, and maybe for similar reasons, like turning a worldview upside down, changing a power structure that people know. So I think that all we can do really is aim for our human development.
Thank you. Dr. Seema, let me bring you in and just ask a quick question to help bring this to a conclusion. I think that for much of our conversation this evening, we've been imagining this work in front of full-time educators in our Muslim schools. But could you speak just briefly, if you can, what lessons of curriculum renewal should a homeschooling parent take from this conversation, or a leader in our weekend schools, someone who's working in the space of educating Muslim children, but not in a full-time Muslim school structure? What do you see as that they should take from this book? Oh, don't forget your mute.
So a couple of us have to do that each night, right? I think it's pretty similar no matter what venue you're in. As parents, you have to watch your children's education, whether it's homeschooling, private school, or public school. So if you start with the first part of the book, the Islamic part, you need that in a homeschool setting. How are you going to develop a culture in your home where children are involved? Are they going to have a sadaqah jar? Are they going to have a giving routine? Are they going to have a helping routine? They need to think, Quran advices, Hadith advices. So I think that fits the weekend school for sure. They usually wind up taking a curriculum from somewhere, maybe their local district, and try to follow it somewhat, or they go online and find something. And there might be an Islamic school here or there that, could help with that. Islamic weekend schools, I think, take curriculums from Noor Art and Iqra, and they need to follow this in order to really meet the questions. The questions children ask require a certain kind of teachers. So parents need to prepare themselves for questions, and Islamic schools in the weekend need to prepare themselves for questions. We can't tell children don't ask. We have to be, well prepared. So, somebody said we need to be reading. I always say we need to be readers. We need to be reading so much. We need to understand prejudice and bias and justice. And I love the idea of, engaging with healthy dialogue with mercy. I don't know if there's a difference. The book is relevant.
Thank you. No, thank you. And it is relevant. And when we realize that education, particularly for within our Muslim community, occurs in many non-formal, non-traditional spaces, we realize the need and the importance of engaging in curriculum renewal so that our work that we're doing on behalf of these young people is relevant to their lives, to help them to be Muslim in the nuances of this context in which we're all seeking ways to draw closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Dr. Sheza Khan, I've invited you to come up into the space, and through Zoom, there's no gracious way to do an invitation to wait for that to be accepted. So I hope that you accept this invitation to be spotlighted here with all of us this evening so that we can honor you for the work that you're doing on behalf of ISLA. Thank you for your role in helping to bring this session to what we see with us this evening. And I wanted to ask if you would like to speak to the broader audience about the work of ISLA and the plan that you have to carry this conversation forward through some type of a virtual book club, and how people can get more information to work with you on that type of an online learning opportunity over the summer.
Assalamu alaikum, Sister Amara, and everybody. It might be hard to remain unmuted. I do have the executive director of ISLA here with me, 4-year-old Zainab Ghani. So, two executive directors. So I'm really glad that we're also muted. I'm also camera is off, but Jazakumullah khairan really for this fabulous panel. It's been so invigorating, and it's an honor of ours to be part of such important work. As you mentioned, Dr. Amara, in the introduction, this is, and Dr. Nadeem, you know, this is continuously brought up by our Islamic school leaders. Okay, and you are very important, Zainab. So I might have to cut it short, but I would like to invite everybody who is interested to continue a discussion to please email me at info@theisla.org so that I can keep you up to date about the book club that we're planning to launch this summer. The idea is for us to just go over a few of the chapters throughout the summer so that's digestible, so that we can engage in conversation and discussion in really important ways that is related to the work that we do in Islamic schools. So, and we hope to also invite some of you, the panelists, to join us and provide like an overview so that it's not heavy lifting per se. I know that we've all got, we all deserve a break this summer after this very difficult year and a half. But it's also important work that we need to continue to discuss. So Dr. Amara, honestly, the pleasure is all mine. The honor is all ours. And we're so grateful. Jazakumullah khairan.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sheza, for your leadership. I'd also like to mention the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World that I'm affiliated with. We will be hosting a series of professional development sessions in the month of August that we are calling Prophetic Pedagogy. It's going to be probably the last 2 to 3 weeks of August, and you can find more information on our website at contemporaryislam.org. We invite educators to join us in deepening our understanding of pedagogy as well. Dr. Nadeem, can you talk about the work that is planned for CITE coming up in September?
Yeah, I mean, these are excellent. I think, you know, it's one of those things that educators always ask about, well, what next, right? When I get the book, now what do I do? And I think the reading group, the book club with ISLA is a great opportunity. The prophetic pedagogy sessions, inshallah, will be amazing, as were the previous sessions through CICW. And CITE, the Center for Islamic Thought and Education, is also going to be offering a professional development short course, an online professional development short course for educators based on this book. So coming September, inshallah, there'll be a launch of an online PD opportunity for educators and school leaders that really want to start to enact this process of curriculum renewal. It'll be based on the book, but it'll really be a way to start thinking practically about putting in the pillars that you need in your schools to do a curriculum renewal process. And for more information on that, you can go to our website. I think what we'll do is we'll put in the chat each of the links for CICW and for CITE. So you have access to our websites in case you need them.
That's great. I'm going to put the link in the chat now for CICW, if you would do the same for CITE. So before we close, I do want to officially thank the leaders of Center for Islam in the Contemporary World. I'd like to thank the leaders of Center for Islamic Thought and Education, the leaders of the Council of Islamic Schools of North America, and the Islamic School League of America, 4 strong organizations that have come together to co-host and co-organize this panel today. And I'm going to take a big leap of faith in saying we will call this the first of many partnerships to come from this group of education institutions that are truly looking to shape how young people, young Muslim people, are experiencing education in their schools. Panelists, Dr. Nadeem, Dr. Claire, Dr. Susan, Dr. Omar, Dr. Seema, thank you for joining us in making this idea into a fabulous reality. I am so excited that we can amplify the amazing contributions of your individual chapters and the collective strength and empowerment that I think the community is going to get from the guidance that comes from this book. If any of you would like to have closing words, by all means, I invite you to jump off of mute and offer your closing words before we end our call today.
I just want to say thank you to you, Amara, for a very lively and dynamic session that you have posted.
Oh, this is all my pleasure. It's all my pleasure. Any other closing words?
Thank you so much, Amara. I was going to say the same. A lot of work went into planning for this, so thank you so much. Jazakumullah khair.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Amara. Thank you, Dr. Nadeem. Everybody else, so nice to see you. And it was a wonderful session. Thank you. AlhamduLillah.
I'll make a quick closing comment. You know, it's how many years ago, 30, 40, 50, when we thought we couldn't have Islamic schools. And then we couldn't have a publishing company. And now we have a new challenge ahead of us, but we can do this. Collectively, together, thoughtfully, inshallah, we can do this.
Inshallah, inshallah. So please, I invite all of you to have your own direct access to getting a copy of the book. Make dua for its continued success. Make dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept the contributions of these authors and educators for all that they have and will continue to contribute towards the strength and the stability of our Muslim young people and thereby our entire Muslim community. Thank you all for being a part of this program this evening. We are recording, so please help us to circulate the recording among the educators in your community so that they too can get access to this great conversation this evening. Assalamu alaikum. Take care.